welcome everybody. My name is Michelle Hagwood. I'm really happy to welcome you here to the Henry Art Gallery. Before we get started, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that we are situated on the land of the Coast Salish people. It is my great pleasure today to welcome and introduce our guests, Demian, DinéYazhi, Miranda Belarde-Lewis, Sara Siestreem, and Tania Willard. And I'll just read a few of their bios. You also have copies of them, and then we will hand it over to Miranda. And we will have time for questions at the end as well. So first of all, Demian, DinéYazhi, born to the clans Neshaha, Tabahai, Zuni clan Water's Edge, and Todachini Bitterwater of the Diné, works across media and form, including poetry and photography, to give voice to and envision a contemporary indigeneity that challenges Western archetypes and notions of authenticity. Rooted in a reverence for traditional Diné culture and social formations, while also informed by the popular culture of their childhood, DinéYazhi's work creates a bridge between the past and the present to imagine a sovereign future freed from the structures of white heteronormative patriarchy. DinéYazhi received a BFA from the Pacific Northwest College of Art in 2014, and they live in Portland, Oregon. DinéYazhi is a recipient of the 2017 Brink Award here at the Henry. This iteration of the award is the culmination of a 5-cycle biennial prize awarded to emerging artists, ages 35 and under, who are working in the Cascadia region of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. The Brink, Demian and DinéYazhi, is made possible by the generosity of John and Sherry Benke, Henry patrons and founders of the Brink Award. So maybe we just have a round of applause for Demian. And then we are also joined by our moderator today is Miranda Belarde-Lewis, who is Zuni and Cliquet. Indigenous knowledge systems are central to her work as she examines the role of the arts in protecting, documenting, and perpetuating Native information and knowledge. She has worked with tribal, city, state, and federal museums to create Native-focused educational programming, publications, and art exhibitions. Miranda has worked with the Fry, the Bill Reed Gallery in British Columbia, the Squamish Museum, and the Museum of Glass. Curatorial projects have included James Ray awardees Stormy Weber and Allison Brenner at the Fry, and she's currently working on Preston Singletary, Raven in the Box of Daylight, which opens at the Museum of Glass in November, as well as a show highlighting the work of Shosho Esquero and the late Clarissa Reisel. Miranda is an independent curator and an assistant professor in the University of Washington's Information School. Sara Siestreem, Honnest is a master artist from the Umpqua River Valley on the south coast of Oregon. She comes from a family of professional artists and educators. Her training began in the home. Her studio work is multidisciplinary. Her primary language is painting, but she also works in photography, printmaking, drawing, sculpture, video, and traditional Indigenous weaving. Her art practice branches into educational and institutional reform. Siestreem created and runs a weaving program for the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. She teaches studio arts and Indigenous studies courses at Portland State University and community education courses at Pacific Northwest College of Art. Her work in institutional reform relates to curatorial and educational practices regarding Indigenous fine art. She lives and works exclusively in the arts in Portland, Oregon. And last but not least, we have Tania Willard, who, Shewetham Nation and settler heritage, works within the shifting ideas around contemporary and traditional, often working with bodies of knowledge and skills that are conceptually linked to her interests and intersections between Aboriginal and other cultures. Willard has worked as an artist in residence with Gallery Gachet in Vancouver's downtown east side, the Banff Center Visual Arts Residency, Fiction and Trading Post, and as a curator in residence with Grunt Gallery and Kamloops Art Gallery. Willard's curatorial work includes Beat Nation, art, hip-hop, and Aboriginal culture, which was co-curated with Kathleen Ritter of Vancouver Art Gallery. Is currently touring. Is currently touring?
It did tour.
Did tour.
It is now.
Yeah, okay. Featuring 27 Aboriginal artists. In 2017, Willard received the award for curatorial excellence in contemporary art from the H. Natashan Foundation, as well as the City of Vancouver Book Award for the catalog for the exhibition Unceded Territories, Lawrence Paul Uqualupton. Public art projects include Rule of the Trees, a public art project at Commercial Broadway SkyTrain Station in Vancouver, BC, and If the Drumming Stops with artist Peter Morin on the lands of the Papaski. First Nation in Edmonton, AV. Willard's ongoing collaborative project, Bush Gallery, is a conceptual land-based gallery grounded in Indigenous knowledges. And Willard is an MFA candidate at the University of British Columbia in BC, and her current research constructs a land rights aesthetic through intuitive archival acts. So a round of applause, please, for all of you. And they'll probably note this too, but images from everybody's work is scrolling behind us. So I will hand it over to Miranda to start.
Keshi, welcome everyone. It's my honor to be here today to moderate this conversation, and I look forward to listening and learning from all of you. I would like to start off asking, and reminding and remembering Thomas King in his book, The Truth About Stories. You know, he really talks about this idea of binaries and how much people love binaries. Like, as humans, we just love to put things into categories, and there's really easy ones for us to put in, you know, to put labels on people and on ourselves. So my first question for Demian, I'm still learning here. How do you like to challenge this idea of binaries in your work?
Yeah, I think initially through my creative practice, when I first started off, I didn't really find myself situated within like a traditional Indigenous art practice, and so I had my own complications in identifying as an Indigenous artist. And so all throughout college, like I really felt more comfortable like navigating more like queer circles and investigating like my art practice through that. And toward the end of my program, I realized that the like queer theory is very similar to like an indigenous like approach to seeing the world. It's really challenging this like more like hetero or like normative structure, and I think through becoming more familiar with my own culture and but also my art practice, I found ways of making artwork that was about how I identify both as like a queer person and as an Indigenous person, and really just saw that anything that I was making like was going to be like traditional or contemporary Indigenous art, but not really limiting myself to like I didn't really want to limit myself to focusing too much on like either of those like traditions or practices. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's mostly like the binary that I come into conflict with is the separation between like traditional and contemporary art, but also I think traditional and contemporary Indigenous or non-Indigenous culture, even like the differences between like assimilating to like Western standards, but then also like maintaining like strong connections to your Indigenous heritage. Like I think those two things also like come through the work. But then also being like also wanting to like challenge the way that contemporary Indigenous peoples or traditional Indigenous peoples like view Indigenous identity. Like it is also like very much tied to this like heteropatriarchal, conservative and like assimilationist agenda. And so even within that, I try to really push and challenge the way Indigenous identity is structured. And I think some of the ways that I've been more successful at that is like trying to identify like the roles within like certain societies. And I can only speak of like Navajo culture, and if I wanted to like really like take into account like the traditional roles of like an indigenous like cisgendered male within my society, I would have to go back like 500 years prior to colonization, in order to like authentically like be living out like this experience as an indigenous traditional person. But you know, through colonization, through the introduction of like Western religion and the church, you know, I think that's been altered. My own role within like my culture has been altered.
All of our roles. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I really appreciate the way that you challenge binaries about art practices, even in the gallery, and your use of text on images of the landscape. I think really challenges to consider what we're looking at when we're looking at images of landscape, what we're looking at in the form of poetic text in the gallery. So I really thank you for that. It took me a moment to process, and I would like to spend more time in there. I look forward to sitting in there and just sitting with the words and the images together. And we were joking about it earlier, saying, you know, these are like this is our original memes, is words on images, right? And so we become this meme culture. But here it is, you know, in the best memes out there make you think about things in a really short snippet of an image and words together, and the brilliance of their placement, you know, can be extremely effective in such a short amount of space or such a brief image that it can be extremely powerful. For Sara, did you want to respond to that?
I did. I don't know how do I turn this one on? Am I? Yeah. Oh, hi. The other thing I want to, on that piece, I think the use of the slide projector is extra important. Demian has this Western fine art training. He went to PNCA, which is a private art school in Portland, and on the West Coast is kind of the big deal spot. And bringing that in is this really important nod to the Western tradition of the art history lecture, which would be in a hall like that, and you would hear that sound, and images move that way. And so it's contextualizing this into this contemporary practice. And I think that it does this really neat nod as well to indigeneity. We are we have a tradition of always being a contemporary people across the board, around the world. We would always embrace contemporary technology. And so I think it's this really important conversation piece to the installation that I wanted to mention, you know.
And for many Native people who come from a ceremonial background, you know, just that repetitive sound is also invoking this indigenous presence in the gallery, because it is just methodical, it's repetitive, it's soothing, you know, it's almost like its own drumbeat in the gallery.
Yeah, it's supremely beautiful. It's so good. You kind of, it's, those art history lectures also kind of make you take a nap a little bit. So you go into like a little bit of a dream state. It's soothing, especially in the wintertime, you know, and it's dark all the time. So I think you've used all of those elements in a really beautiful way. And the other thing I would mention on that, Demian has this incredible graphic design sense, which I also identify as an indigenous powerhouse. All the elements being reduced to their most significant, powerful composition, and the integration of the text onto those. It's another poetic form to bring those together that so many people strive for, and I don't think very often succeed. So it's every single piece of that exhibition is so great. Will you talk about the neon? I haven't heard you talk about that part yet.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, I gotta hear that part.
Okay, briefly, the neon. I was thinking of how language become like within the Navajo tribe, like the Navajo language becomes a written language like through the code talkers, like in World War II. So the United States government like exploits the Navajo language and turns it into like a weapon of warfare against other non-white communities in an ongoing tale of really gross colonialism. But then also within the reservation, like the Navajo reservation in particular, like, tons of uranium is extracted from the reservation. And then that uranium gets used in the same war. And then indigenous people become like exposed to, toxic radiation, both like while they're at war and then also once they're back. And so I was thinking of using the neon both as a nod to the Route 66 culture, but also how language has, within the Navajo tribe, and with all indigenous tribes, like the Navajo code talkers weren't the only code talkers, but how language becomes this really powerful political tool, both by indigenous people and non-indigenous people. So the radiating qualities of the neon sign become significant in I was trying to create this relationship between that and like the toxicity of uranium mines. So like there's this or uranium extraction. So there's this slideshow that's on the back of one of the billboards that's called Hey Jolene, and that piece is talking more specifically about like forced extraction and like the influence of like settler colonialism within Gallup, New Mexico, and this entire region, like border towns, essentially. And so the neon, I'm trying to use that as like a ceremonial act of like ongoing indigenous presence and survivability, but also as this like contemporary art form that the gallery has to respond to. So there's like a white band in the center that is also referencing like Diné symbology. Like there's the Navajo wedding basket with like a break in the circle that's kind of like a pathway outward. And so when I was growing up, like my mother always made sure to tell us that like that needs to be pointed east toward the sun. The entrance of a hogan, which is like a contemporary structure for indigenous peoples, both as a dwelling and also as like a ceremonial space, also needs to be pointed toward the sun. So there's like this like really deep reverence for the sun. So whenever a contemporary art institution hangs this piece, they have to respond to that. They have to hang it properly, which is not the tradition of contemporary Western art spaces. Like they didn't give, like, anyway, they sorry, my parents are here. So I would normally be cussing like crazy, but I'm trying not to. And they're recording it, yes. So anyway, yeah, I feel like that piece is enacting ceremony through a contemporary indigenous art practice while also trying to push forward this like indigenous aesthetic. The frame of the neon sign is also the hexagonal shape of a hogan, and then in the background you have like the cardinal direction, sort of, like kind of like a compass. But within the Navajo tribe, like the number 4 like is repeated. Like a lot of ceremonies, like one part of the line will be repeated like 4 times. There's the 4 sacred mountains, which we reference as like our ancestral lands. There's the 4 cardinal directions. There's 4 gender systems. So I'm kind of also using that, and also simultaneously using like Diné color symbology. And I think when it's just like the white band and there's just like the frame coming up, like through photographing it, it also has like a presence of like a drum, and it also just looks a little punk rock. So yeah.
Looks like a drum, and it also looks like a halo. So then
Yeah.
whoever's looking at it, can draw whatever reference they will draw. We're all projecting our own identities and thoughts onto artwork all the time.
Right.
And so then having that space that keeps on changing as the circular band starts to glow, and then the words start to glow. It just lets us interpret it however we need to at that moment.
Yeah.
But thank you for bringing up that point about the gallery. And Tania, can you tell us a little bit about how you incorporate the land into the gallery and the gallery into the land?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll talk about that as we look at a couple of these images, because a couple of these images are from a performance that was able to host at Bush Gallery with Demian. And so this comes from a reading of a piece called Infected Sunset. And it's a long durational poem. And Demian performed this November, December last year. It was around then, just before the snow fell on our lands up in Secwepemc, which is my traditional territories up near Kamloops, BC, in that area. And this is located on my home reserve where I've rebuilt a home and I'm raising my family, trying to be closer to our language, land, and culture. And so Demian was able to come and perform this amazing work, both at Kamloops Art Gallery, which is kind of the closest public gallery to where I'm located on my reserve, as well as on my homeland in my territory. And those images we saw earlier are now what the text pieces, which as Demian read, and he sort of read to the land itself in some ways, as opposed to Kamloops Art Gallery, where we had a nice, intimate crowd and also had a reading. But this was something I was so happy that Demian was up for, because I wanted to get this sense of what is it like to be in this kinds of context, which are lovely contexts in gallery and institutional spaces, but what does it mean when we can also take that and bring that to our home territories and in our land bases? And because so much of our histories are based on the dispossession of our lands and our bodies from our land, Bush Gallery for me is a project that reassociates us with our lands and with our families and with the kinds of ways that we interact in much less formal kinds of ways when we're land-based. And so what's so beautiful is just recently, before I came down on this trip down to the coast, which is so amazing to be on Coast Salish lands. I spent many years in Vancouver, but it's so beautiful and grounding to be in these places. But the snow had finally melted. And so there's no more snow on the ground, but of course all the grasses had been laid down by the weight of the snow. And then I was able to see the texts again. The text, as Demian wrote, as he read, he just kind of passed the papers down onto the land, and we just left them there. And so those few images are the start of new grasses kind of bursting through pages of the paper, and how they've also sort of disintegrated. And there's little passages left. And we worked with text in other ways at Bush Gallery, and it's just this, speaking of the kind of constant presence of the binary, and whether we're on the land or in the gallery, whether we're on our reservations or in the city, whether we're working from the past or working, in the present, are just, as Indigenous identities, we're so kind of oppressed by the binary. And I thought of this, I thought of your work as really about this relationship, and it's how I try to place what Bush Gallery is for me as well. It's an interrelatedness with the lands around us, and so your text, beautifully is now related to my land, and so there's this gesture of hospitality and reciprocity, I think, encoded in that. And for me, that's what that project has become. And it briefly, it started as a kind of reaction to working in many different Western kind of systems and galleries, which I'm very supportive of Indigenous artists as curators, as directors, as embodied in the gallery as much as possible. But I also see the ways in which what galleries are is not kind of, or hasn't been responsive to Indigenous ideas of aesthetics, what we value as art, how aunties might be working on regalia in the community, how basketry functions as knowledge systems when it's in our communities. And so Bush Gallery was a chance to do something a little bit different, and to start, instead of traveling to different cities, which has been amazing, I also wanted to place work in my homelands, also because I have young children. So, leaving them to do gallery tours or something in different cities, especially when I was breastfeeding and really wanting to have that connection to my children, was challenging. And so so Bush Gallery came up as a collective project, also with Peter Morin and Gabriel Hill, other artists I work with. And it's about kind of making relationships and interrelated ways of working as artists, but with centering Indigenous-led projects that are about galleries and about aesthetics and about art, centering that and reassociating ourselves with our land bases.
Wow, that's incredible. And it reminds me of a lot of Sara's work, Sara's, and I was wondering if, Sara, you could build off of Tania's practice of building and re-establishing relationships with the land and traditional territories, but also in the assertion of treaty rights in your arts practice.
Yeah, I can talk about that stuff. Where to begin? I thought I had a different trajectory, but thank you. So to backtrack a little bit and give you guys some context. So my tribe, I'm Honnest Coos, and we work with the Lower Umpqua and Sayusla and then the Millet Coos people. So our 4 bands in the 80s joined together to regain our federal recognition. My grandfather and his contemporaries did that work and were successful. So at that time, our tribal government became organized in a federally recognized way, and we've been rebuilding since then. And it's in my generation that we're going back to reclaim our cultural lifeways as far as our traditional practices, weaving, the language, all the different kinds of the arts in those ways. Suquamish guy told me last year that a culture enters their wealth when they can reclaim their arts practices. So we're in that generation where we're starting to expand that work. Because I'm a artist at that level, I've developed my own language in painting. I'm teaching now other artists who are coming up. I'm working museums, all those kind of things. So I've got the intellectual infrastructure to start to pursue with some sense of responsibility our weaving tradition and access to knowledge holders. So I work with museums with the knowledge holders there and the basket collections. So I've got all this academic infrastructure that I'm working with, but then there's the issue of the land interface. Our baskets are made out of natural materials, and so I have to explore our traditional landmass to find these plants, these ancient gardens that my people have been cultivating for thousands of years, but they've been in hibernation for 150, 160 years waiting for us to come back. So for the last 5 years or so, I've been working in the field, kind of exploring all of our areas to find where our most precious plants grow and to start up a conversation with these plants to see if they want to come and be part of this practice with us again, which means that I spend a lot of time in the field. And it's not just going the day I want to gather them, but it's visiting every month and watching the plants and paying attention to what's going on with them. That's the in the field part. The ceremonial part happens there. And then there's the contemporary part where I've got to go home and get on the computer and call the feds, call the state, call the landowners, start to establish those relationships too, because that's a contemporary reality that we're living with. And going through all of the paperwork and finding that one little line in there that says Native people have a right to do this in these places. So when I call the first time, they're like, oh, no, I don't think so. I'm like, oh, that's okay. And I call the next day. I'm like, oh, I found it, like page 83 in the 7th line down there at the bottom. And that's the sovereign rights part, is coming in and saying, no, actually we can. And coming back and then coming back and coming, and they're like, wow, you're not going away. I'm like, no, I'm not. And I'm going to be doing this, and I'm going to be teaching my people how to do this, and we're going to be coming here all the time. And when we're here, we're not here to entertain you. We're not here to be observed or put on workshops for you. We're here to pray, and we're here to pick up our cultural practices. So we're not to be disturbed, and that's also protected. So that's the sweet, sweet part. And the other part that's really exciting about it is that all of my students work for my tribal government in natural resources, so they're politicians. So they take this knowledge and integrate it into the political work that we do, which I think is a traditional practice. And so they're using weaving knowledge and the ceremonial aspects to inform the preservation and protection of these places, because there's, again, those little lines there in the bottom, these old treaty rights that they want to ignore, that we can layer in as a gossamer layer of protection. So I'm from the South Coast. Coos Bay is down there at the south end of Oregon, and you guys are probably all familiar with LNG pipelines, that kind of stuff. So Coos Bay is economically one of the most depressed areas in Oregon. And there are bays all along Oregon, but ours is the one that they really are focusing on because we are one of the most poor economically. Logging and fishing went belly up in the 70s, 80s, and so people have been poor for a while. And so pipeline folks really push on those kind of communities and promise a lot of things. So the tribe has been involved and has to be involved legally and all that kind of stuff. And so it's really important to me to be able to add something to the conversation, and it turns out that this weaving cultural practice has some political legs that are pretty exciting. You know, it's a special, sweet, and beautiful component to the arts that I think, again, goes into Indigenous ways of knowing, where in the non-binary, we, you know, an art form will have, in my culture, will have a spiritual aspect. It'll have a scientific aspect. The composition will be perfect. It will have all of those things, whereas from a Western perspective, well, science would be over here, and spirit would be over here, and, you know, art would be over here. And so it's a really important, like, tie-in, I think, to what we're speaking about, that it would do all of those things, and that the weaving would actually have the longest political legs of anything else I could do. It's to me a particularly lovely point of poetry to it, you know, that this old lady thing is the strongest thing I've got, you know. So did I answer at all what you were asking for?
Yes. And I really, I enjoy seeing how weaving is something that ties all of our communities together. You know, because there's the Salish wool, there's the cedar, and then there's the Navajo wool. And for me on my mom's side, Tlingit, and so then the auntie that I'm still trying to help realize an exhibit about her work. You know, she passed away last year. Her name is Clarissa Rizal, and the chilkat weaving of Tlingit, it blends cedar and wool together to form a really sturdy sturdy warp, and then the wool, you know, becomes the weft, and then the designs come out. And to see that there's all these different threads, what other types of threads are you seeing in your work? You know, for people in the Northwest, how are you bridging Southwest and Northwest together?
Oh, me?
Yes. the star of the day.
Oh, no. I want to talk more about Sara and Tania's practices, and also like the influence of like creation stories and emergence. And I know that you're also speaking to that like through Zuni traditions and ancestry. But I feel like I'll answer your question real quick. Sorry. I'm not sure how I'm bridging the relationship between Pacific Northwest tribes and my own tribe. I feel like there was something you said. We had a meeting like last week over the phone, and you were talking about like being a cultural ambassador for your tribe. And so I've always sort of felt that having a conversation about like my Indigenous Diné ancestry and a lot of the things that are going on there, like I felt somewhat of a responsibility to be having this conversation outside of the reservation. And I think just through having that conversation outside of like New Mexico or Arizona, I'm also put into conversation with other Indigenous peoples who live in the Pacific Northwest, who are from tribes in the Northwest, who just through like the acts of colonization suffer from the same sort of experiences. And so, there's forest extraction on the reservation. There's like the LNG pipeline going in. There's the strong fishing community and fishing rights, and a lot of that protesting and resistance that really helps push like the energy that's needed for the Indians of all tribes occupation in Alcatraz back in 69 to 71, and in turn really influences like the emergence of the American Indian movement. So I feel like just through maintaining some sort of like strong cultural reverence, like and through like the power of Indigenous ceremony and medicine, like you're just brought together with relatives who your ancestors may or may not have like come upon. So I guess that's how I think of it.
And also seeing how the push for treaty rights, up here in this region, it spawned the fish wars, literally spawned the fish wars in the 60s in Nisqually and Puyallup nations down in Tacoma. And then the way that galvanized not just the activism, but also the art and the literature. And you see all of these different places where we see ourselves not just in stepping into the spotlight of activism, but also being able to see a pathway towards education, seeing a pathway towards law, seeing a pathway towards public speaking as an extremely powerful method of getting through and breaking across these mainstream audiences, where we can find the allies and we can find the folks that are really, can see that it's not just an Indigenous struggle, but that human rights, Tracy Rector, who's an incredible curator here in Seattle, she can make these posters that say Indigenous rights are human rights. And you see that echoed in sentiments about, women's rights are human rights, but if you look at how the issues that are plaguing territories, water, and the health of children and women in Indigenous communities, that's really the marker for what's coming down the pipe for everybody. And if anybody has felt somewhat threatened in the last year, you have 1/500th of a sense of what it feels like to be Indigenous on the continent. And so I really appreciate all of your work, saying, really pushing the treaty rights, pushing the responsibility of taking care of the land. But to go back.
Oh, I just wanted to clarify, because the context in British Columbia is different in terms of treaty. So just because our communities and many Indigenous communities in British Columbia have been advocates against the treaty process, so it's a different context in that British Columbia sort of made a little sleight of hand when they joined Confederation in Canada, and so much of the territory. Over 100% of the territory of British Columbia is claimed by Indigenous folks, and there's only a very small number of treaties in British Columbia. So just that context the context of our relationship to our lands and our rights to our lands is exactly the same, but that sort of political relationship with governments is a little different. So just that where I'm come from, we don't have treaties. So it's actually just a kind of an illusion and an oppression that fuels the system we find ourselves under. And that's why we're so much stronger together. That's why, weaving, when you're coiling a basket or when you're gathering your threads for a warp or a weft, it's that gathering that is so strong.
And it's been an interesting learning point for me too, because I was born in Zuni and I grew up down there, and then when I came up here, everybody's talking about UNA, what the heck is a UNA? Because the usual and accustomed to usual and accustomed, what are we talking about here? And then, so then that enforcement of the treaty rights and the reliance on the treaty rights up here is not something that is really in the language down in the Southwest as much, you know. And so it was a steep learning curve for me moving up here too. And it's really important to recognize that a lot of times, you know, every single treaty has been broken. So then in the U.S., and if it's being called the way it is as a false sense of security or a false sense of protection like it is in Canada, then that's an important conversation for us to have.
Well, I'll just say one other thing, Sarah, that struck me, which is that it's a similar principle that I try to work with at Bush Gallery, which is that the use of our traditional lands, our harvesting, the knowledge we have that comes from our land, our ceremony and our spirits out on the land are also our strength and an act, you know, and is an act of political dissent. To go out. So it's like amazing that you do this work in harvesting and being out on the land. And in Secwepemcúlecw, we have very similar kinds of ways of working. A lot of people will go and harvest birch, and they might have to get the codes for the CB radios because of the logging trucks coming down to say, hey, we're coming up, and you know we have a right to do this. And so there's just so many of our ancestors who just struggled and had such strength to be able to sort of have us be in this place and have these conversations. And that work is unheralded and sometimes, you know, unknown. And so I just nod to that and acknowledge that strength that has brought us, you know, into the place where we can have these exciting conversations and build these futures together.
Yeah.
Anybody can answer this question, but you know, we did talk about the importance of knowing our own histories and knowing our own cosmologies and epistemologies. And so how do we know what we know as Indigenous peoples? And so then how does your origin stories from your communities influence your art practice? This will be our final round of, our final question before we start taking questions from the audience.
Okay, so my own creation stories. Well, first off, we would travel a lot on the reservation. I grew up in Gallup, New Mexico, which is like 20 minutes away from Window Rock, and the imaginary border between like between the Navajo tribe and the United States. And so we would always drive from like Window Rock to Ganado, like back to Chinle. And when I was younger, I was really fascinated because my mother would start telling like stories, like creation stories, also talking telling stories about like the coyote, like trickster coyote. So I always felt like there was this like really strong relationship between living things, living spirits, living animals, humans, and like the earth. And so much of the creation stories that are in the stories that she would tell, like, you know, a heel could, or like shiprock could be like a fallen bird, like that crashed into the landscape or something, you know. So it was also about imagining like this non-European mythology within, and then with, you know, getting older and starting to read more about like the Diné creation stories and like the emergence of colors and the non-existence of like a physical world, but also knowing that like each direction had like a really special and particular color just like radiating from like a direction was really captivating. And then also like through the Navajo creation stories, there's also like going, like there's the emergence of different worlds. So like passing from like the first world to the second world to the third world to the fourth world to the fifth world. And so I've always viewed that as like this ongoing conversation or this ongoing practice of like migration, of moving between like different regions. And then within like the, you know, more Western anthropological belief and narrative, like the Navajo like moved down from like northern Canada to where we are in like present day, you know, the American Southwest. So I think that's played like a really important role in my practice, both how I think about connection to land, but also trying to restore and reclaim this connection to cosmology. I mean, within my work, I've been talking about like uranium a lot more and its effects on indigenous communities, but like uranium as a mineral like has ties to universe, like the universe, you know, like everything on Earth has ties to like this other cosmic energy. And so I try to like imagine a time prior to colonization when there was more of this non-scientific connection to the stars and the universe around us. I saw this movie, I forget the name of it. It's based in the Amazon. It's a black and white movie. Embrace of the Serpent. Yeah. Oh my God, that movie just like devastated me. And it was astonishing because I was imagining like these entire relationships that indigenous tribes had, both to the land but also like to sacred cosmology, like has forever been shifted and impacted through colonization. And that's like a sacred connection that I feel like will take like centuries to like rebuild and like reclaim, if it's even possible. So I mean, that's how I've come to like work and like be influenced by like emergence or like reemergence, but also trying to like challenge even the binary between like how we view the land and the sky, like thinking of like, you know, like there's this more sort of stereotypical idea of like Father Sky and Mother Earth, right, within like indigenous philosophy. But I'm more interested in seeing the perspective of the Earth as like this genderless queer body, or the universe as like this genderless like queer body. But also how that does have ties to like, there's one piece that I created with this collaborator, and it's talking about like through one's own birth like into the world, there's also this like cosmic migration that like occurs between yourself and like your ancestors. So I also think of like the womb of a mother as like a very sacred space that has ties to like cosmology. Yeah.
Yeah. And on a side note from that, the Lushootseed language, which is a Coast Salish language, doesn't have gendered pronouns. And so then there's all these stories, you know, because you have to self-identify, you don't put that onto, you don't have to put that on there, you know, so that way everybody could operate genderless in a conversation. And there's stories about two-spirit people around the time of Lewis and Clark who were documented, they never identified themselves. And Stormy Weber's out there nodding her head because we use the story of a two-spirit warrior who was mountain interior Salish from Montana, who through different documents early in her life, she was documented as a wife and as a woman, and then later on, through other people's documents, she was documented as a man with wives. And so it's really interesting to see that historical connection, but also that she never self-identified what she was. You know, she was born female, but because that is not reinforced through a gendered language, you know, it was just what it is. But can you talk a little bit about your how your origin stories?
Yeah.
Practice?
Yes. Although, geez, you had such a beautiful thing you said. I was going to, and then I wouldn't, and I will. And I'm actually going to start with you, Miranda. The first time I had the life-changing opportunity to hear this human speak, it was at the Smithsonian at the advice and invitation of Kathleen Ash Milby, a really important woman on this planet too. And it was at a conference, and every superstar that I'd never heard of before was there because I didn't go to a school that knew anything. And anyway, Miranda introduced us to the concept of for Indigenous eyes only, and the idea that you don't have to tell everybody everything, and there are certain things that are private, and it's okay, even in an educational forum, to say this isn't for you, and here's why. And it was a totally exciting, liberating concept to me, that we can keep things private and then use that as a learning point. And so in that, I'm not going to tell you guys our origin story, because it's really tender for us, and we're just getting a hold of some of this stuff. So I'm going to keep that to myself. But what I will share with you when we get to my baskets is mud dye from there. So we're coming into the spring, and so a lot of our gathering is starting to come on. And one of the things that's particularly beautiful about getting to lead this work is watching the youth come into their culture firsthand. So we've got elders in there, and we've got people my generation who never got to grow up with this, but these youth, it's first person for them. So they get to go out in the land all the time, and they get to be around all this stuff all the time, and for them it's just how they're growing up. And so it's going to be intrinsic to everything they do. They're not going to remember learning to do these things. It's just part of what we do in April. It's part of what we do in May, and all that kind of stuff. So next month, I'm taking them out to where we think the world began, our origin story place, to dig up the blue mud that we make our blue dyes from. It's in this basket here, that kind of dark gray color. This is a ceremonial basket for carrying eagle feathers around. And then this one is called, we used to, crawfish trap science fiction. We used to eat from the stream. It's the shape of a nuclear power plant thing. So that blue mud is in the place where our origin story is located. And so we use it to dye roots, which we use to make the baskets. So it all kind of goes together like that. And I'm so excited to share with all of you guys that these kids are coming into this story like an everyday thing. And in a couple generations, they'll probably be really comfortable sharing it with you. And then so stick around and keep up with us, because it's coming. It's coming.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
I'll briefly comment. I have had the opportunity to be relearning a lot of our language, Sohwat-Machshin. It's an interior Salish language. And in that, why I kind of talk about that in origin story, and also speaking to the idea of pronoun and binary. Also, I think in many Indigenous languages, those gendered kinds of ways of explaining or relating to things are virtually non-existent. And you can see that in many anthropological texts with early speakers whose first language was their Indigenous language, and then they've learned English. They're not consistent with pronouns when they tell stories, which is really beautiful. And so in learning language, for me, that is what I relate to origin story, because it's in the language, and which is so narrative based, and it's so much the story of our lands and our people and our history and our future, as in terms of an origin story. It's in the language that so many things are opened up into a worldview that's very different and very non-Western. it's not even decolonial because it's pre-existing all of that thing. So it's really it's been amazing for me to learn more of our language and learn things about, different stories about the north wind or the south wind where they're very animate, so they're not, a static thing, how we might scientifically refer to some kind of object in a natural setting. They have personalities, they're animate, and I think this is true in many Indigenous stories and histories and science. And it's in that kind of opening up of this other way of relating to each other, to the earth, to the non-human, to the mineral, to the cosmos itself, that I think that's where I find that idea of origin, and so for me, how it influences my work is it's in that kind of really dense, interrelated web that I try to then enact my practice, so that I might, bush gallery is a way for me to relate to that. So is different methods of socially engaged work, so making sure that people in my community might be interested in coming out to something. It's always harder to convince them to come to the gallery sometimes, so that's also part of Bush Gallery, is like placing it at home so people can't avoid me as much. No, gotta come out. Also, I have some good barbecue or something. And so for me, it's that it's learning language, and I guess for myself, I didn't have the opportunity to grow up in my language fluently. And so it's been in the later part of my life that I've learned so much more, and that, but my community has been very committed. And though we have a few speakers, there has been an immersion school for over 25 years, and my children go to this immersion school. And similarly, Sarah, to what you're saying, is that they're growing up in this completely different consciousness, whereas my generation still grew up with a gap and with all kinds of trauma that I think my dad's and mom's generation faced equally as difficult. And they're growing up in this way where they're essentially fluent in their language, and so they're just having this different view, and it's our future. That's so exciting, and it's our future and it's our past simultaneously, and that's also our origin. I think we carry that in our hearts, and we carry that as related to our lands.
It's a beautiful way to end this panel, but I think I would like to thank everybody up here and congratulate Demian again. And then Michelle is going to take the microphone around if you have any questions.
Hi, I'm Yolandi Casey, and I have a really quick thing I wanted to share. I'm the Native Advisory Committee chairperson for the Seattle Public Library. And I wanted to let you all know, and everyone in the audience who might be an artist, an Indigenous artist, we have a program called YAHAW, which is YEAHAW, which means lift up the sky. And it's for all Indigenous artists of all types and from everywhere, including Canada, Washington, Oregon, California. And the due date is April 20th. It's on Facebook, and so you can go through the application on Facebook. And Tracy Richter and Asia Tail are the curators. We're going to display all the art pieces of all types of mediums at the King Street Station, starting, we believe, in May through probably the end of the year. So I wanted to invite you all to apply.
Do it.
I had one quick thing. I really liked that piece right there. What it reminded me of is it's in English, but it reminded me of when you were talking about treaty rights, and right there it made me think that that's how they think about the treaty. Mm-hmm. They're disrespecting it, and they pretend like it doesn't exist. And so it's disintegrating. And so I'm so glad you're here to keep those treaty rights going. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll go here then.
Join me guests. My name is Jared. I come from the Midwest, the United Tribe out there. And I had a question about how you kind of walk that line. We can talk about like our traditional art. Because out in the Midwest I taught music. And the big difficulty out there is when you're dealing with the elders in the community, because they've gone through all that trauma, there's a strong sense of protectiveness about those traditions. And in music, traditionally, true for a lot of our tribes, we have our ceremony songs, and those will always be our ceremony songs that we have to honor. But then there was also, just the stuff we sing because we were just getting together and having a good time. So how do you, as artists in your mediums, kind of ensure that you're respecting that tradition and honoring it, but then how do you find the proper level of comfort to take that leap where you're taking a certain style of basket weaving or a certain concept from a story and extrapolating it? Just where do you find the confidence to, where you draw that line for yourself, what you're willing to play with and heighten, so to speak, and what you just as is?
I mean, I'll just respond in saying I think it's a constant kind of continuum where you're checking yourself, you're checking in with family, you're checking in with your own center and how that feels, which is very indistinct. But I will say that we face challenges in our communities as well, right? They're not these little utopias. We have challenging ways, challenging personalities, all that in their beautiful complexity. And so for me, that's why I positioned Bush Gallery as a place of, quite, performance practice. That's not, it makes a lot of sense in Indigenous tradition, but it might also be a leap for somebody to think about. But I wanted to preserve that space of really critical, really pushing the boundaries and the edges of how we think about art practice or music. So I positioned it as experimental in some ways, I guess, so that if people are coming or approaching what we're doing, then they understand that we're trying to hold up that space to begin with. And then maybe there's less misunderstanding about using something traditional in a different context, and then also just try and be really, humble about it and to ask where I can. But I guess I also think that it's important we have the confidence to carry new things. They always contain, it's always connected. It always is Indigenous art. It always is still traditional because those are our ancestors and you can't take that away. So I just try and be brave and do it, and then if I get it wrong, then somebody tells me and then I learn.
Some of the images that you see cycling up here are from an arts project in Zuni, and it's called the Zuni Map Art Project. And Ian, if you can jump to those images. There's, it was decided by a group of traditional leaders in Zuni, and we have what's called this is one of the images here, but this is depicting our emergence point, because for Zunis, we came up through the Grand Canyon, through 4 worlds, and for Zunis, this is the 5th world. And then we received divine instruction to go find the middle place, and so we did. And we went all over the Southwest looking for it. And we left markers for ourselves, and this is a map of Zuni. And this is also showing that emergence story and the migration story. And so this is at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque. But for us, we have it's called ZCRAT, and it's the Zuni Cultural Resources Advisory team, and it's made up of religious leaders in our community. And so for them, if you like you said, I love that about, check with your center. How does your gut feel about making this, and how does it feel about putting it out there? Because making it is one thing, putting it on public display is something totally different. And so if there's ever a question about any of that, for us, we have the ZCRAT that we can go to and, put it to them and ask them, what is this appropriate? And so I consulted with them a lot as I was doing my dissertation work. And so I'm an artist, but I don't participate in exhibitions anymore. But when I was doing my research, I really consulted with them because I needed to make sure that I would be able to go home after I did my research, because I really like going home, and I want my son to be comfortable there. And so for me, I was just making sure that things were there. And thank you for bringing that up, Sarah, because I don't think I came up with that, but I was deeply influenced by also the work of Audra Simpson, who is a Mohawk scholar, and she writes on this idea of ethnographic refusal, of what we refuse to put out there. We know what it is, we know what's important to us, and we're not going to share it with the outside world. We'll share it within certain circles or with each other, with ourselves, but there's some things that we just don't make public. But that means that for that very small area that is extremely precious and dear to us and to our community, there's an infinite amount of expression available to us as the creative beings that we are. And so we can take that and express it in a multitude of ways, and to do it through music is hitting several different types of sensory points that will hit people in different ways, and also in ways that you can't imagine. And so, if you do it, then you're going to be impacting and putting out their works that are going to have resonance in ways that you just can't imagine until you do it.
I'll say something briefly. My mother is like the best sort of like, if I think that there's something like perhaps that I shouldn't be, or areas that I shouldn't be going into, I usually will have a conversation with my mother about whether that is appropriate or not. But I think also, yeah, there's just this like spiritual sense of like what you're able to tap into and what you're able to or what you should like stay away from. There is one piece, Ian, could you go to that, the burying white supremacy, which was a really difficult piece, but that is currently on display at the Whitney Museum of American Art. This piece I had the privilege of working with a collaborator, Ginger Dunnell, on, and it's a 4-minute and 11-second video, I believe. And this is all just drone footage that we had taken on the Navajo reservation. And as an Indigenous Diné person, I feel like a natural right to be able to make art on the reservation, on our ancestral lands. But when Ginger and I first began this project, we didn't really ask permission from the land. A lot of the work that we make together is about having this relationship and this conversation with the land, and all the energy that has fostered it or continues to nurture through death and survival. And so when we first created this project, we just didn't ask that permission. We didn't follow any sort of protocol. We didn't make an offering. And so we immediately just screwed up and smashed the drone into the side of the canyon. And that was that was a very expensive lesson through capitalism. But it was amazing because it meant that we could reassess what the project was. We could reassess what we were coming up against. The idea of burying white supremacy was a really challenging one because we were also seeing white supremacy as this really dark negative force like witchcraft. So it was also, when we're going through these steps of conceptually giving people instructions to bury white supremacy within themselves and within their communities, we were also trying to set the intention that any harm that or anything that we were doing through this project, we were doing so in a very positive light. And we did so in a way that didn't cause or intend to cause harm against other people or other living things. So I think that's also a really strong element in this as well, is having more, that is I think central to a lot of things that we're talking about is like having like an ethical, I mean, if you want to call it ethical within like a Western mindset, like responsibility to the land itself, of like not leaving your mark. And creating this piece, we were also had a hard time with it because we didn't want to physically dig into the earth. Indigenous lands, you know, face like tons of like exploitation and like forced extraction. So we didn't want to follow in the tradition of like contemporary European artists and leave like a physical mark on the earth. And so this was important for us because we were engaging in land art in what we considered an honorable way with our like with my ancestral territory. So yeah, I think that's like a really like valuable way of like thinking about, I mean, and through Sara's practice, like going out and like getting materials from living, thriving plants and taking enough of the material that you still leave that root system alive and able to rebuild and like gather strength. I think that's also a really valuable thing that, you know, we should consider.
Yeah, and he called you. We went out gathering one time, and he wasn't sure as soon as we got there, and it was so beautiful because that's absolutely the protocol is asking consent, getting quiet, spending long time to where your interior can start to talk to you. I mean, we talk about ancestral memory, that all of this thousands and thousands of years of a practice don't go away in a couple generations, you know? And so even though we might have lost touch with that conversation, or we did anyway, in the everyday continuum, it's in there, it's in your blood, it's in your DNA, and that'll speak to you if you can get into the practice. Ian, can you go to my paintings? So like I mentioned, I didn't have the privilege of growing up weaving in the land, and but I have been painting like this since I was a little girl. It's natural in my family to be working this way. And so my weaving or my painting practice is a kind of a state of prayer, and I can go into it pretty quick because I've been doing it so long. And when I enter that state, I'm seeking the land that exists within me, my psychic connection to the land as I contain it, as we all contain all of the universe. And by having a real fluency with that part of my body, from those years of practice, it's a natural pathway when I get into the field. So I can start to have the land tell me what to do. Getting into weaving in this traditional practice, the differential on responsibility was terrifying, because it's one thing for Sara Siestreem to make some paintings and say they're coos. I get to say that, that's my privilege. And growing up, I thought if I could get these into museums, that'd be so good for my people. Like, oh, that's coos, I'm proud of that, right? But to be able to bring weaving home and give them that for themselves, that's out of this world bigger deal, right? But think about the responsibility. What about when I get it wrong? What about I teach them something that's wrong? That's so scary. And the grace of this work is that as soon as I realized it was time for me to start pursuing this, not only did the support start flying in, so did money and all of that, institutions being real interested in my work, but so did the elders and all the different tribes all around. Greg Archuleta and Greg A. Robinson are my weaving teachers, and like immediately, as soon as I started saying to Lisa Watt and Dina Dart, hey, I think it's time, everybody was like, go to these men. And they're in your town, and you can go once a week for free and hang out with them, and they'll take you everywhere you need to go, all year round, all the stuff. So because they already did this work 30 years before I got to them, you know? And so everybody's been real supportive, and that's up and down the whole coast. And it started with Dr. Terry Rothkar. She was inducting a Raven's Tail robe into the Portland Art Museum, and I got to go to the event because I was working for them. And it was in her dancing that robe into the collection that the lightning struck that, oh, it's time, you need to start weaving. And so that day forward, everyone was like, here. And you know, it's kind of like going down a mountain with no breaks. It's real scary how fast this is happening, and it's a great question because that's the biggest thing is like, what am I going to do? But it's everything you guys are saying too, is to like try to quiet myself and open up to my ancestors who I'm carrying around with me, who are going to tell me to the best of my knowledge or the best of their kind of ability what to do. And then also the humbleness you're speaking of. Before I give any lessons, I always say, this is how I do it. And these are the reasons why, and here are the people who taught me these things. And to also remember that every single person has a different way of doing the exact same thing, and every single person is right. You know? And putting that out there and saying, this is what I think today, and I'll tell you as soon as I find out what's wrong with it. And be wide open to if somebody else has something different, and then we talk about it. I mean, I think that's part of the beauty of academia. Parts of it is that you can work within those flexibilities, and we can start. You have to have one hard line in order to start a conversation, but then being really willing to flex and move on it. So, thank you. What a great one. Yeah.
Is there another question over here somewhere?
I probably am loud enough to speak. I just wanted to say thank you, first of all. I am so glad I came. This has been so wonderful, so thank all of you. But Sarah, when you were talking, I started thinking about movement, and then I was already thinking about what you said, Demian, earlier about how, or I think it was you, somebody was saying that there's composition and science and something else, and they're all used together. It's not like they're separated. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about movement relative to your composition process, and if you think that movement kind of enters into it, and if it does, how it does. That's kind of, I'm a poet, so I'm kind of like reaching to the abstraction, so you could probably take this in another different directions, but thank you again.
Is that for me or Sarah?
For everybody, for anybody that wants to answer, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a whole bunch of different ways. I teach 2D design, so I'm instantly like, well, the movement in a 2D composition is blah, blah. And so I won't do that one to you, though. I might go more poetic and say that we're salmon people. And the metaphor with that is particularly, as I get older, starting to show up a lot more. And that's about you being born in one place, and that's your home. And then traveling and getting stronger and learning all the things and going way so far away from your home. And then eventually you start to head back, and then you spawn and you make the next generation. And so I found out that my life has kind of turned into that sort of a thing. You know, I'm from the South Coast, really super, super rural. My family, we moved to Portland for jobs in the 80s. That's where I grew up. I still live there. And now that I'm doing this stuff, I travel up and down and back the coast. There's kind of a route that I go around. You also think about like the seasonal round, what we used to do, where you travel around throughout the seasons to, you know, we go over here for fishing, then we go over here for winter camp, then we come over here in the fall. You know, we do this kind of life way that's really beautiful because you get to go to the different places and the different things happen at the different times. And in a contemporary sense, fueled by dinosaurs, we're running around doing the same thing, only it's a way bigger track, and it has all of these kind of, like doing this today. This is a mini migration that I got to come up and work with you guys yesterday and be here with you guys today. So I like to look at those metaphors and be like, oh, this is a contemporary salmon story that we're doing right now. You know, and that's movement. They'll be there both in line but also in the story. And I was thinking about when you asked about how he is combining the Northwest Coast, Southwest. I think this conversation is kind of a basket, you know, where we're putting all of our different cultures together in this conversation. You guys are the spokes, you know. There's a lot of those beautiful metaphors that we overlook because we're thinking about, oh, it's a digital thing or it's social media or whatever. It's like if you start to look at the canisters of our culture from way back and open up to the metaphor of it, I think it's really powerful and exciting. You know, and it's okay that it's electric a little bit, you know, like it's got a whole another kind of poetry in it that's live or time-based, right? Like you guys will all take this conversation, take it in when you go home, you'll talk to somebody about it, you know, it'll have those kind of legs. I think that's cool.
Yeah. I think to draw off of that a little bit, I think the slideshows are a really nice way for me to like slow down a lot of like both poetry and just or more poetically like the work that I do. I started off mostly as a writer, but a lot of the poems that I read are like just really fast. Like I don't really take a break between sentences or stanzas, and so a lot of the times it's speaking to like this urgency of like Indigenous survival, of Indigenous issues, of being a queer person and living through like the HIV and AIDS crisis, and how my existence like is a force and threat and resistance against like white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, capitalist colonization. And so through the more poetic and performative work that I do, like I try to push that urgency. It's not about giving the reader or listener like enough time to digest each sentence. It's more about throwing all these visuals into their mind. So by the time one line ends, like they're already being like another image is already like being like pushed in front of them. And each person has to like grapple or like bring their own relationship like with a collective story or with a song. You know, like there's a slide in there that says, "You made me feel like a natural woman," and a lot of it is really playful. You know, the slide "Hey Jolene" is a reference to like "Hey Joe," and even like "Jolene" by Dolly Parton. Yeah. So like there's a lot of play there, but with the slideshow it allows me to like slow it down a little bit more, and yeah, so I think that's one way that movement has played a role in the work.
What I was going to say. I'll just say that we don't have any kids here today. Any little ones running around? There's some little ones? Okay, I always like to make sure to welcome little ones. Hello. Because in terms of movement, they're like always on the move. And it's, again, a kind of inspiration of Bush Gallery to create spaces like when we can, it's wonderful to gather like this and listen to each other. But I also like to create spaces where people who need to move a lot are centered. And so out on the land is often my context for that. But, you know, that's, little ones are our future, and they're always on the move. And, you know, and our movement, I know a number of performance artists, and they're, you know, going to different performances all around, and they really assert that Indigenous context of like, this is our way, this is our seasonal round. It's just a seasonal round of art making now, maybe, although it was also, or though it is. And so, you know, that assertion kind of, again, brings us closer to not always feeling like we're distanced, or these ideas that we're, you know, can put down Indigenous cultures by saying we're acculturated, and what is making us distinct, all these different ways that that can be kind of eroded our, you know, the right to our identity, the right to our ancestral ways and our knowledges. And so that is, you know, that is the movement. And so I relate that to ideas of our resistance, and movement as part of that. The movement, all our movements together, our resistance.
Okay, this is probably our last question. Hi, my name is Haley Honnest. I'm from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. Well, I have so many questions for you guys. You're all amazing. But I'm a contemporary and traditional dancer, and my questions of contemporization involve maybe how dance is sort of slower on the contemporization scale versus art. And I'm just wondering how you all deal with notions of essentialism, which are imposed upon you from the outside and from the inside, about how and what we make always being Indigenous, regardless of whether we just revitalized our dance, or whether you just revitalized weaving, or whether the painting you make, Sarah, is actually Coos, everything about it, even if it's done in a contemporary medium, and weigh And then how you, so that's one question, and then how, if, and on what terms you deal with acceptance or refusal of your practice from within your communities. On the dance side, one of my good friends is Dr. DinéYazhi, and her and her partner Mike, their work to bring legitimacy, not worrying about the outside world, and also grappling with that internal dynamic of their own Tsimshian communities, to say what is traditional, and to push back and to say we don't always have to sing the old songs. Like we know them and we cherish them, and in communities like Michael's, where her generation, she's my age, and her generation is the first generation in 100 years to grow up dancing, and which provides this rich area for them to innovate, knowing their traditional practices and seeing images of them, but having that freedom, that intellectual and creative freedom to create their own unique traditions now. And Tlingit on my mom's side, and I was gonna say, I can't speak for all Tlingits, can't speak for all Northwest Coast people, but let me just say that I am jealous of how free the Tsimshian dance moves are, because they get to lift up their knees and they prance. Like, to me, it's like, it just looks so liberating, and the weight of their robes, they don't use the same wool felt that we do, the Tlingits do, and so their robes have movement, and so then when they're dancing, it just looks so much fun. For me, the fun in Tlingit ceremony is being there with my family, but hands on hips and swaying back and forth, and that's our move, and and it's graceful and dignified and all of that, but I want to dance like a Tsimshian sometimes, and and so to be able to embrace that and really claim that the way that they do is just inspiring. So I would say for that, look at their model and talk to them, because they they're answering both of those questions that you asked about having the freedom to say it's traditional and contemporary at the same time, and that's okay. And this is how we're going to deal with it in our own community when we get pushback.
I'll just add that you can Google her PhD. It's really incredible. She has done a lot of time to sit back and think and articulate what it means for them to be choreographers, to be performing for different crowds, and to work in different kinds of ways on a continuum. And I think that's when we talked earlier on the phone, what I brought to considering this question. It's something that you often are working with as an artist of Indigenous ancestry or background or experience, is that I often try to get away from the binary of the contemporary and traditional. Right? It doesn't really serve us. Actually, it doesn't really serve us. And so what I like to think about is a continuum. That we are in a continuum of innovation. Tradition only became tradition because we probably had some really fantastic, ancestor artists who introduced some really awesome new things that, people gravitated to and that became tradition. And we have the power and the right to make new traditions as long as we are centering and upholding and valuing, what has come before us as well. Then we have every right to make the future.
Another resource for that is Dr. Nancy Meithlow. She's Chiricahua Apache, and she, in her book talking about Native female artists, she also examines that question of, is it Native art because a Native person made it, or is it Native art because it looks like Native art? And she really challenges that question, and I think that's something that a lot of contemporary Native artists struggle with. Even if it's not a struggle for us. A lot of times it's a struggle because people ask us, well, how do you define this? How do you, what kind of exhibit are you trying to have here? What do we call this in the flyer? And so then it becomes the struggle to define what it is that we're doing. And it's a struggle for curators as well, because we're trying to help other folks discover this, because there's power in the messaging, and there's power and strength in the artwork itself. But to have to define it in such narrow confines, it really doesn't help. Like Tania said, it doesn't serve us. So then we have to push back on the entire museum complex and say, okay, well, who is this serving, and who is this for? Because if we're Native people making art that honors our traditions and ancestors and spirituality and landscapes and territories, then who are we making this art for? And then do we need it? Do we need it to be in a gallery? No, we don't. Take it to the Bush Gallery. And then who is it for? So then is it for our ancestors? Is it for our kids? Is it for both of them all at the same time? Is it for the museum patrons? Is it, and working for the Burke, with these different city, state, local museums, we really have to question that of how we're going to participate in this, because we don't want to be there just for the show. We want it to be honored in a way that we understand it needs to be honored. But we also understand that we are living in this capitalistic society, and so then people are putting monetary value on it, and that value of it just being in the gallery is going to lift it up. And so are we taking it out of the context that we originally intended it for? And so we just have to be mindful and careful about how we do that and how we go forward.
Thank you. Was there something else you wanted to add?
No.
Okay. That was, all of this is so incredible. Thank you all for your generosity and bringing this conversation into this space. And Demian for giving us a space to further reflect on these ideas through your work, and for bringing together all these people. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope you'll, of course, you've got time. Museum's open until 4 to check out Demian's show. I also invite you to come back tomorrow with families if you'd like. We have a screening tomorrow of Indigenous shorts, showcase curated by the Northwest Film Forum and Longhouse Media. And so that's free. It'll be in this room. And we'll have our Ed Studio open for those who need to move. So thank you all again. A round of applause for our guests.